welcome to my channel. Today's story is a journey of secrets, transformation, and a side of myself. Hey, friends. We're working our butts off to bring you this content, just for your entertainment. If you like what you see, here's a deal: instead of offering us tea, just hit that subscribe button. It's way easier, totally free, and honestly makes us just as happy. Here we start the story. I grew up in a house where identity was treated like something you inherited, not something you discovered. My father was kind in the way many busy men are kind. He worked, he provided, he fixed what broke, and he expected the rest of life to fit into a quiet, orderly shape. My mother carried the softer labor, the invisible choreography of meals and schedules and birthdays, but even her tenderness came with boundaries. There were things we talked about at the table and things we didn't. There were feelings that were normal and feelings that were dramatic. There were questions that were interesting and questions that were unnecessary. And in that climate, the earliest signs of who I might become didn't arrive as declarations. They arrived as small, private moments of attention. Some of my first memories are sensory, not narrative. The sound of hangers sliding along a closet rod. The coolness of tile against my bare feet while my mother got ready in the morning. The smell of hairspray drifting down the hall like a signal that grown-up life was in motion. I remember being fascinated by the idea that a person could change the way the world read them by changing fabric, color, silhouette. It didn't feel like desire in any adult sense. It felt like curiosity about language. Clothing was a kind of sentence, and I wanted to understand how it worked. I was the kind of kid who paid attention to details and then felt embarrassed that I had paid attention. At school I learned early what got you teased, what got you left alone. Boy was a narrow lane with high guardrails, and I stayed between them because the alternative looked painful. But even when I stayed inside the lane, my mind wandered. I wondered why certain things were assigned to one group and not another. I wondered why softness was treated like weakness, and why wanting beauty was treated like betrayal. I wondered why I could feel comfort in things I wasn't supposed to even notice. When I was 10 or 11, I had one of those moments that gets filed away not because it was dramatic, but because it was quietly formative. My mother was folding laundry in the living room, half watching the news. A pile of clean clothes sat between us like a small mountain. She handed me a stack of towels, and I carried them to the hallway closet. The closet door was open. I could see coats, scarves, a pair of shoes set to the side. I don't know what impulse moved me, only that it was quick and instinctive. My hand brushed a scarf, a soft knit one in a muted color. I lifted it, feeling the texture, then held it up to my neck just to see. The mirror in the hallway caught me at an angle. For a second, I looked like someone else, or like myself in a different dialect. My heart did something strange, not racing exactly, but waking up. I put the scarf back immediately. Not because I thought it was wrong in any moral sense, but because I sensed, like an animal sensing weather, that being seen would change the meaning. In that house, a scarf on my neck would not just be fabric. It would be a question. And I wasn't ready to ask it out loud. In adolescence, most people learn to live with a certain amount of contradiction. You become a walking negotiation between what you feel and what you think you're allowed to feel. Puberty didn't clarify things for me, it complicated them. The world got louder about gender. Boys were expected to become more manly, as if manhood were a product you could buy with the right posture and the right indifference. I could do the performance well enough. I played sports badly, joked along when other guys joked, and learned to keep my eyes moving when I passed a makeup aisle in a store. But inside, the curiosity didn't go away. It matured into something more reflective. It became less about wanting to be something and more about wanting to understand why the boundary felt so loaded. Sometimes I would catch myself thinking about the women in my life, my mother, my teachers, my classmates, and the way they were allowed a wider emotional palette. They could be gentle one day and fierce the next. They could decorate themselves, reinvent themselves, and people would argue about whether it was vain or empowering, but at least it was a conversation. Men, by contrast, were often allowed one or two tones: competent, funny, angry. Even sadness had to be translated into silence. I didn't know the language for identity exploration. In my environment, crossdressing wasn't talked about as a human behavior with many motivations and meanings. It existed only as a punchline or a scandal, something to whisper about, something to turn into a caricature. That absence of honest framing was its own kind of pressure. When you can't place a feeling in a sane category, you start to wonder if the feeling itself is insane. So I built a private compartment in my mind, a small room where my curiosity lived. I visited it alone. I told myself it was just curiosity. I told myself it didn't mean anything. The problem with telling yourself something doesn't mean anything is that you end up watching it closely to make sure it stays meaningless. And watching something closely is, in its own way, giving it significance. In late high school, I had one of those accidental encounters that feels scripted only in retrospect. I was home alone one afternoon, doing that half-hearted homework that is really just waiting for the day to end. I went into my parents' room looking for a stapler. The stapler was not there, but what I found instead was a small container on my mother's dresser, lid slightly ajar. It held makeup, simple things, not exotic, a compact, a lipstick, a small brush. I remember staring at it as if it were an artifact from a different planet. Not because makeup was mysterious, but because it represented deliberate transformation. It was evidence that my mother, who seemed so natural in my childhood memories, actually constructed her presentation each day, like anyone else. The idea that presentation was built, not inherited, hit me like a concept I had been waiting for. I didn't touch anything that day. I just looked, then left the room. My restraint was not virtue. It was fear. Fear of being caught, fear of being mislabeled, fear of not being able to explain myself. I wanted a controlled experiment, not an explosion. College gave me distance from my family's expectations, but it didn't give me immediate courage. I met people who lived with fewer guardrails. I saw men with painted nails, women with shaved heads, people who refused to perform gender in the tidy ways I had been taught. I admired them, but admiration didn't automatically translate into permission for myself. I was still carrying the old belief that my curiosity was a hidden flaw, something that might disqualify me from being taken seriously. I dated. I worked. I built a life that looked stable from the outside. And for a while, I thought maybe the compartment would stay small. Maybe it would fade as I matured. That's another story many of us tell ourselves, that maturity is the erasure of complexity. In reality, maturity is often the opposite. It's the slow recognition that the parts of you that persist are the parts you have to learn to live with honestly. The person I eventually became most honest with was not a therapist at first, not a friend, not my family. It was my partner. I met them in my mid to late 20s, when I had started to believe in the possibility of a relationship built on more than compatibility and good timing. They were attentive in a way that didn't feel like surveillance. They listened not just to what I said, but to what I avoided saying. They noticed patterns in my mood. They asked questions that were gentle but persistent, like someone knocking on a door without trying to break it down. We built our relationship in the ordinary ways: dinners, long drives, arguments about dishes, laughter in grocery aisles. But underneath the ordinary, my private compartment kept pressing against the walls. It showed up as restlessness. It showed up as a kind of melancholy that didn't have a clear cause. Sometimes it showed up as irritability, because unresolved shame has a way of leaking out sideways. One evening, after a small disagreement that was really about stress and not about the thing we were arguing about, my partner sat with me on the couch and said, quietly, "I feel like there's something you're carrying alone." They didn't accuse. They didn't dramatize. They didn't demand. They just stated what they sensed. And because they said it without threat, I felt the first crack in my usual defenses. I didn't tell them everything at once. I told them a version that felt safer, like testing water with a toe. I said I had always been curious about gender presentation. I said I sometimes wondered what it would feel like to wear clothes that weren't meant for me. I said it made me feel confused and embarrassed. I said I didn't want to hurt them or make them uncomfortable, and that I didn't even know what it meant. They nodded the way someone nods when they're hearing the truth, not the performance. Then they said something that I still remember word for word because of how simple it was: curiosity isn't a crime. But hiding can become one if it makes you disappear from your own life. That sentence didn't solve anything. But it shifted the framing. It made the issue less about whether I was allowed, and more about whether I was alive in my own skin. It also introduced something I hadn't expected, the idea that my partner could be an ally in the process rather than a judge. Still, even with that reassurance, I felt terrified. Because it's one thing to admit curiosity in theory. It's another thing to let someone see you enact it. For weeks after that conversation, we didn't do anything outward. We just talked. We talked about childhood, about the scripts we inherit, about the ways masculinity can become a cage even when you're not consciously rebelling against it. My partner asked me what I imagined, what I feared, what I hoped. I told them I didn't want it to become a secret life. I didn't want deception. I didn't want to use them as a prop. I wanted to understand myself without turning it into a spectacle. They responded with the kind of responsibility I now recognize as love, not just support, but boundaries. They said they were willing to explore with me if it stayed honest, non-sexual, and rooted in self-understanding rather than escapism. They said they wanted us both to feel safe. They said if either of us felt overwhelmed, we would slow down. That mattered more than any enthusiastic encouragement could have. It turned exploration into something ethical. And then, one day, without announcing it, they did something that changed the entire arc of my life. I came home from work on a late afternoon that had been heavy in the usual way, emails, deadlines, small social performances that add up to exhaustion. Our apartment was quiet. My partner wasn't in the living room. I called their name, expecting an answer from the kitchen. Instead, I heard their voice from the bedroom, calm and oddly formal. "Can you come here for a second?" No rush. I walked down the hallway with that mild irritation you feel when you think you're being called for a mundane task. But as I got closer to the bedroom, I sensed something different. The light was warmer than usual. The door was open, but the room felt staged, like someone had cleared it of clutter. Then I saw the bed. Laid out carefully, as if for a guest of honor, were clothes. Not my clothes. A soft top in a neutral color, not loud or costume-like. A skirt that looked simple, elegant in its plainness. A pair of tights folded with the kind of precision you don't use unless you're trying to communicate respect. On the dresser, arranged like a small still life, were makeup items, a mirror angled toward the light, a brush set, a compact, a lipstick that wasn't a bold red but a muted tone. Next to them, a small pouch held accessories, nothing extravagant, just a bracelet, a pair of earrings, a hair clip. There was even a note, handwritten, resting on the bed. My body reacted before my mind could form words. My mouth went dry. My chest tightened. A wave of heat moved up my neck. I felt like I had walked into a version of my life that I had only ever imagined privately. It was exactly the thing I had been curious about, presented without mockery, without dare, without irony. And that made it more intense, not less. Because it meant my partner had taken me seriously. They stood behind me, not touching me yet, letting me look. I could feel them watching my shoulders for signs of panic. I was standing there like someone who had been offered a gift they weren't sure they deserved. "What is this?" I asked, but my voice came out too thin, like a whisper with edges. My partner stepped beside me. "It's an invitation," they said. "Not a trap. Not a test. You don't have to do anything." But I thought, if we're going to explore, maybe it helps to remove the pressure of asking for it. I looked at the note. My hands shook a little as I picked it up. It said, in simple handwriting, "I set these up because I love you, and I want you to know you can be curious without being alone. If you want to try, I'm here. If you don't, I'll put it away and we won't speak of it until you choose to. No matter what, you're safe with me." I read it twice. The first time, I cried without meaning to. It wasn't dramatic sobbing. It was the kind of quiet crying that comes when something in you finally stops bracing for impact. For years I had been holding this curiosity like contraband. Now it was being treated like a human question. But acceptance can be frightening too. When shame is familiar, relief feels unfamiliar, and unfamiliar can feel dangerous. My mind spun with worries. What if I tried and felt foolish? What if I tried and liked it too much? What if it changed how my partner saw me? What if it changed how I saw myself? What if this opened a door I couldn't close? I sat on the edge of the bed, still holding the note. My partner sat next to me, leaving a small space between us, an intentional respect of my boundaries. They didn't rush to hug me. They didn't say, "Don't be scared," as if fear were a problem to be solved. They just said, "What are you feeling?" I searched for words that didn't feel like excuses. "I'm nervous," I said. "And I'm embarrassed. And I'm also grateful. And I'm scared that this makes it real." My partner nodded. "It is real," they said gently. "But real doesn't mean out of control. It just means we're not pretending it isn't part of you." There was a long silence. In that silence, I realized the suspense wasn't in the clothes. The suspense was in the decision: would I continue living as if self-understanding were optional, or would I risk being seen? There was no audience, no dramatic music. Just a bedroom, a partner, and my own internal history. "I want to try," I said finally, and the words felt like stepping onto a bridge. "But I don't want this to be a joke." "It won't be," they said. "We'll go slow. We'll make it about comfort and self-respect." They asked if I wanted them to leave the room while I changed. I said yes. Not because I didn't trust them, but because I needed a moment alone with the threshold. When they stepped out and closed the door softly behind them, I stood and looked at the clothes again. My hands hovered as if touching them might trigger an alarm. The first thing I put on was the tights, and that small choice felt strangely symbolic. I had spent years thinking of femininity as something distant, something other. Now it was literally against my skin. The sensation wasn't magical, it was simply different. The fabric was tight, smoothing my legs in a way I wasn't used to. It made me aware of my body as shape rather than tool. Then the skirt. I pulled it up and adjusted it at the waist, the way I had seen my mother do with her own clothes, the way I had seen countless people do without it meaning anything. But for me it meant everything, not because of what it looked like, but because of what it represented: permission. The top came next. It was soft, draped differently than my usual shirts. When I looked in the mirror, I didn't see a transformation into someone else. I saw myself, but interpreted differently. That was the most disorienting part. It wasn't costume. It was translation. My heart was still pounding when I called my partner back in. They entered slowly, as if approaching an animal that might bolt. Their face didn't show surprise. It showed recognition, like they were seeing me more fully. They didn't laugh. They didn't clap. They didn't say anything exaggerated. They just said, "You look like you're holding your breath." I exhaled, realizing I was. "I feel ridiculous," I admitted. "You don't look ridiculous," they said. "But even if you did, that would still be okay. The goal isn't perfection. It's honesty." We moved to the dresser where the makeup was laid out. My partner asked if I wanted help or if I wanted to try myself. I said I wanted them to guide me, but I wanted to understand what we were doing, not be handled like a doll. They smiled at that. "Deal," they said. They explained each step as if teaching me a skill rather than initiating me into a secret club. "This is foundation, it evens skin tone. This is concealer, it helps with shadows. This is powder, it sets things." They were careful, gentle, and they kept checking in. "Is this okay? Do you want to stop?" That constant consent did something important: it kept the experience grounded. It reminded me that the thrill wasn't in crossing a taboo. It was in reclaiming agency over my own presentation. When they brushed my hair and pinned it back with a simple clip, I saw a glimpse of myself that felt both foreign and familiar. I didn't suddenly feel like a different gender. I didn't suddenly have a new name or a new life. What I felt was softer. I felt space. I felt the guardrails shift outward. I felt my identity become less like a verdict and more like a conversation. But joy and fear arrived together. When my partner held up the lipstick and asked if I wanted to try, I hesitated. Something about lipstick felt like a more visible line crossed, a more public symbol. I imagined my father's face if he saw me. I imagined a coworker's laughter. I imagined the word man being revoked from me like a license. My partner noticed. "We don't have to," they said. "I want to," I replied, surprising myself. "I'm just scared." They handed it to me. "Then you do it," they said. "Your hands, your choice." I applied it carefully, clumsily at first. When I was done, I looked at myself in the mirror and felt a strange, quiet satisfaction. Not because I looked beautiful in any conventional sense, but because I looked intentional. I looked like someone who had decided something. Afterward, we sat on the bed again. My partner asked what the experience felt like. I thought about the question seriously. I didn't want to give a simple answer that would reduce it to a trope. "It feels like I've been living with a locked door inside me," I said slowly. "And I didn't even know how much energy it took to keep it locked. Now the door is open, and I'm not sure what's behind it, but I can breathe." My partner took my hand. "That's the point," they said. Breathing. That night didn't end with spectacle. It ended with conversation. We talked about boundaries. We talked about privacy and honesty. We talked about whether this exploration was something we would keep between us for now, not out of shame, but out of care. We talked about how secrecy can poison relationships, and how privacy can protect them. We talked about how I didn't owe anyone an explanation until I understood myself enough to speak clearly. In the days after, I noticed how my mind tried to turn the experience into a test. Did it mean I was transgender? Did it mean I was gay? Did it mean I had been lying about who I was? I realized I had been trained to treat any deviation from gender norms as a final answer to a multiple-choice question. But identity doesn't always work like that. Sometimes it's not a label you discover. Sometimes it's a life you learn to inhabit with integrity. I started reading, carefully, not to find a community to perform for, but to educate myself. I learned that crossdressing can mean many things to many people: comfort, creativity, self-expression, relief from rigid roles. I learned that it doesn't automatically dictate sexual orientation or gender identity. It can, for some, be part of a larger journey, but it can also be simply a facet of expression. The educational part mattered to me because ignorance had been feeding my shame. The more I understood, the less monstrous my curiosity seemed. Still, knowledge didn't erase fear. The fear moved from my internal world to the external one. What would happen if someone found out? Would my family reject me? Would my friends understand? Would my workplace judge me? The consequences were real because social norms are real. You can't self-accept your way out of other people's prejudice. My partner and I developed strategies, not as a way of hiding forever, but as a way of pacing ourselves. We agreed that our home could be a safe space, and that I could explore there without having to make announcements. We agreed that if I ever wanted to share with someone else, we would choose carefully and do it with intention. We agreed that my mental health mattered more than my need to prove bravery. At the same time, I took responsibility for not turning this into a secret that isolated me. I started therapy, not because there was something wrong with me, but because I needed a place to process the collision between my private truth and my public life. Therapy gave me tools: how to identify shame-driven thinking, how to separate fear from fact, how to tolerate uncertainty without rushing to resolve it. It also gave me a framework for ethical self-disclosure, that honesty is not dumping everything on someone at once, it's choosing the right time, the right person, and the right context, and being prepared for the impact. One of the hardest lessons I learned was that self-acceptance isn't a single moment. It's maintenance. It's waking up on days when you feel confident and still choosing not to mock yourself. It's waking up on days when you feel ashamed and still choosing not to punish yourself. It's building a life where your inner world and outer world are not at war. There were setbacks. Once, a friend made a joke about a man in a dress on television, and I laughed along too quickly, too loudly, the way people laugh when they're trying to prove they belong. Later, I felt sick. Not because the joke was about me specifically, but because I had betrayed my own empathy. I realized that the fear of being targeted can turn you into someone who helps aim the target. That moment taught me that integrity isn't just about what you admit. It's about what you refuse to participate in. Another time, my mother visited unexpectedly, and I panicked about whether anything in the apartment would reveal my exploration. I had no clothes laid out, no makeup visible, nothing that would have outed me. Yet I still felt the old dread. It wasn't the objects I feared. It was the idea that her gaze could reach into the part of me I had kept separate my whole life. During her visit, I watched myself become smaller, more performative, more careful. After she left, I sat in the quiet and grieved a little, not because she had done anything wrong in that moment, but because I realized how long I had been editing myself for her comfort. In therapy, I began to see my identity exploration less as an isolated topic and more as a doorway into a larger pattern, my habit of trying to be good by being invisible. Crossdressing, in my case, wasn't about becoming someone else. It was about allowing myself to exist on a broader spectrum of expression. It was about admitting that the version of masculinity I had inherited was too tight for my emotional life. As months turned into years, the practice became less charged. That doesn't mean it became meaningless. It means it became integrated. Sometimes I would dress in a more feminine way at home, not as an event, but as a choice. Sometimes I wouldn't. The goal was never to replace one costume with another. The goal was to feel like I had options. My partner and I also learned how to talk about it without making it the center of our relationship. We had to protect our bond from turning into a permanent identity project. We had shared hobbies, shared responsibilities, shared laughter. We made sure intimacy, in the emotional sense, was not contingent on my exploration. They didn't become my guide forever, they became my companion, which is different. It meant they could support without carrying the entire emotional load. Eventually, the question of telling someone else became unavoidable. Not because I needed validation, but because secrecy had limits. I didn't want to live a double life. I also didn't want to announce something I couldn't explain in a way that would be kind to myself. I began with one trusted friend, someone who had shown empathy consistently. I told them in a quiet moment, without drama, that I had been exploring gender expression, that it had helped my mental health, that it didn't change my love for my partner or my values, that it was simply part of becoming more honest. My friend listened. They asked respectful questions. They admitted they didn't know much about it, but they wanted to understand. They didn't turn it into a joke. They didn't turn it into a headline. When I left that conversation, I felt lighter, not because I had gained approval, but because I had survived being seen. Not everyone responded perfectly. Some people were awkward. Some made well-meaning but clumsy assumptions. A few distanced themselves quietly, as if my honesty had made me contagious. That hurt, but it also clarified something. Relationships built on my performance were not relationships I could afford to keep feeding. Loss is painful, but sometimes it's also information. The biggest unresolved question remained my family. I didn't rush it. I had to consider safety, not just physical safety, but emotional stability. I had to consider whether telling them would deepen my life or simply satisfy an internal demand for confession. I realized that I didn't owe disclosure to people who might weaponize it, but I also didn't want to keep my family in a permanent state of partial truth. When I finally spoke to my mother, it wasn't during a holiday or an argument. It was on a quiet phone call when she had time to be a person rather than a role. I didn't lead with terminology. I led with feelings. I told her I had spent much of my life trying to be what I thought was expected. I told her I had struggled with anxiety and self-criticism. I told her I had found a way to explore self-expression that helped me feel more whole. I told her it was non-sexual, private, and rooted in mental health and self-understanding. I told her I loved my partner and our life, and that this was part of that life, not a threat to it. There was silence. Then my mother said, carefully, "I don't know what to do with that." And I appreciated her honesty more than I would have appreciated immediate acceptance. She asked if it meant I wanted to be a woman. I said I didn't know, and that I wasn't trying to force an answer. I said it might simply mean I was a person who didn't fit neatly into the strict version of masculinity I was raised with. I said I wanted her to know because I wanted our relationship to be real. She didn't say, "I understand." She didn't say, "That's wonderful." She also didn't say, "Never speak to me again." She said, "I love you," in a voice that sounded like she was holding something heavy and trying not to drop it. That was enough for a start. My father took longer. He was quieter, more rigid in his thinking, and more likely to interpret anything unfamiliar as a personal challenge. When I eventually told him, I kept it simple and grounded. I did not ask for permission. I did not apologize for existing. I stated it as part of my life, explained that it was private, non-sexual, and about self-understanding. I told him I was still the same person in the ways that mattered, responsible, committed, caring. I told him I wasn't asking him to get it immediately, only to respect that this was real. He didn't respond well at first. He said something about not understanding the point. He asked if I was trying to embarrass the family. His words were harsh, but underneath them I heard fear, the fear of social judgment, the fear of losing the son he thought he knew, the fear that the world would be unkind. That doesn't excuse hurtful reactions, but it helps explain them. I told him calmly that I wasn't doing this to hurt anyone. I told him that shame had done more damage to me than honesty ever could. I told him I would not debate my existence, but I was willing to answer questions if he asked them respectfully. The call ended tensely. I sat afterward feeling hollow, then oddly steady. Because I had not collapsed. I had not begged. I had told the truth with dignity. That was a kind of integration I hadn't known was possible. Over time, my father softened in small increments. He never became fluent in the topic, but he learned not to attack it. He learned that my life did not fall apart. He saw that my relationship remained stable, that I remained employed, that I remained myself. Sometimes people need evidence more than arguments. It's not fair, but it's reality. As I moved into my 30s, I noticed a new shift. The exploration stopped feeling like a separate chapter and started feeling like a thread woven into the rest of me. I could look back at the child in the hallway with the scarf and feel tenderness instead of embarrassment. I could look back at the teenager who laughed at jokes to stay safe and feel compassion instead of contempt. I could look back at the young adult who thought secrecy was the price of belonging and recognize how hard they were trying to survive. The most valuable lesson of all was not about clothing. It was about how identity is often less about making a dramatic declaration and more about making consistent, humane choices. The choice to treat yourself with respect. The choice to tell the truth without turning it into a weapon. The choice to be patient with your own pace. The choice to empathize with others who are still trapped in stereotypes. The choice to build resilience in the face of misunderstanding. I also learned to hold nuance in the way I talk about social norms. Social norms are not purely evil, they are tools that help people navigate the world. But when norms become cages, they stop serving human life. If a norm requires you to amputate parts of yourself to be considered acceptable, then the cost is too high. And if a norm makes you treat other people's self-expression as a joke, then the norm is training you in cruelty. Crossdressing, for me, became one of the ways I practiced empathy toward myself. It reminded me that the inner world is not obligated to match other people's assumptions. It reminded me that courage doesn't always look like public defiance. Sometimes courage looks like quiet honesty at home, practiced over and over until it becomes a stable part of your life. Sometimes it looks like asking for help. Sometimes it looks like setting boundaries with people you love. Sometimes it looks like accepting that not everyone will understand, and choosing not to hate them or yourself because of it. If you're listening to this and you recognize any part of your own experience in it, I want to be careful with what I say next, because I don't believe in giving people a single roadmap. But I do believe in a few principles. One is that you deserve to explore identity in ways that are safe, ethical, and grounded. Another is that confusion is not failure, it's information. Another is that you can be responsible and still be complex. Another is that you don't have to turn your private exploration into a public performance to make it valid. And another is that you are allowed to take your time. I don't tell this story because I think everyone should crossdress, or because I think crossdressing automatically leads to one particular identity outcome. I tell it because it taught me something universal: the parts of us we exile do not disappear. They wait. And when they wait long enough, they start to shape our lives from the shadows. Bringing them into the light, carefully and responsibly, is not indulgence. It's mental health. It's integrity. It's the work of becoming a whole person. I still have days when I feel the old flicker of shame. It doesn't vanish entirely. But now, when it shows up, I recognize it as an echo, not a truth. I remind myself that my worth is not determined by how well I conform to someone else's idea of a man. I remind myself that my partner's kindness wasn't a miracle, it was a model of how love can be practical and brave at the same time. I remind myself that the bedroom where the clothes were laid out wasn't just a setting. It was a turning point where secrecy became choice, and choice became growth. And maybe that's the quiet heart of it, not the thrill of doing something in secret, but the relief of discovering that the secret was never shameful in the first place. The real thrill, the real liberation, was realizing that I could be honest without being reckless, tender without being weak, curious without being lost, and that my identity could be a living thing, examined, cared for, integrated, rather than a verdict delivered by fear. Thank you for watching and spending this time with me. If this story helped you understand yourself or others a little better, feel free to explore more on the channel.